Symposium this afternoon. So as Nathan mentioned, I'm going to show a little bit of my research into brain network changes and also development of human memory across the lifespan. And before we start looking at brain changes, I do want to mention that, of course, as cognitive neuroscientists, we are very interested in these changes in the brain, but mainly because we think these are the neural correlates of cognitive changes. Because it's well known now, and this is found consistently in the literature, is that even though we see some improvement with older age in cognitive function, as you can see here in this one line that goes up with older age, that is vocabulary, most of our cognitive functioning actually declines with older age. So this is memory function declines the older we get, executive control, processing speed, all of these. So what we're interested in looking at the brain changes that correlate sort of with these cognitive changes. And a lot of the research that has been done, one of the earlier work, has been looking at changes in brain activation when people are actually performing a task. So task-evoked activation. I'm actually also showing some of that work, of my own work here today. So it's not only focusing on brain functional connectivity, but of course, I will also be looking at these functional connectivity changes. And this is what we've seen a large growth of in the last decade or so. Focusing on within network connectivity, between network connectivity, and also whole brain connectivity changes. So what do we already know about brain network changes across the lifespan? So there's a lot of groups that have studied this. I'm just going to highlight one of the researchers that looked at this. And a lot of this work, they've looked across the lifespan to see what are the changes that we see in brain functional connectivity. And one of the consistent findings is lower default network connectivity with older age, as you can see here in the work by Alireza Salami. So he shows across the adult lifespan, so from 20 years of age to 80 years of age, that here in the posterior default network and then also in the anterior default network, that we see a decline, sort of a steady decline of connectivity within this network with older age. So we've seen this across studies. This has been consistently shown. It's not the only network that we see changes in with older age. There is some evidence also from other networks, but this is definitely the one that has most consistently been shown across different studies. And it's also been associated with performance on tasks that were done outside of the scanner. So it does seem to be related to some changes in cognition. So what Alireza Salami did as well, he's also looked at hippocampal connectivity. And he specifically looked at this because the hippocampus is very important for memory function, and also because the hippocampus has strong connections with the default network. It's not one of the core regions, but it does have strong connections. Although interestingly, what this group found is that they found an increase in hippocampal connectivity with older age. So I was a little bit surprised by that, especially seeing the decreases in default network connectivity, and also because in other studies they've sort of shown either lower connectivity of the hippocampus or no effects of the hippocampus. So I was interested in looking into this a little bit more and putting this in the context of really looking at the projections of the hippocampus, because the hippocampus is a very complex structure. And if you look at some of the projections, it actually seems that there are different pathways for different memory types. And that you see that, and let's see if I can show you here, that here at the hippocampus, that it really seems to be a division with more anterior regions projecting to this anterior system, and then the posterior hippocampus to this posterior system. And this posterior system is actually that same regions that are also the default network. So maybe because this inconsistency in the literature is driven because of the heterogeneity of the hippocampus that was not really taken into account in these previous studies, and that there actually may be a different effect of age on anterior versus posterior hippocampal connectivity to these other brain regions. So that's what we looked at in my lab. And indeed, we found specifically for the posterior hippocampus, and that's what you can see in red here. So the posterior hippocampus to these default nodes, there we really saw a significant effect of age, so that it was lower connectivity with older age. And this was in a healthy adult sample from 18 years to 83 years of age. And as you can see here, specifically in here, the upper right, so the hippocampus to medial prefrontal cortex, here we see that the different interaction with age between anterior and posterior hippocampus. Then we also looked at just the hippocampal connectivity, and we saw that the anterior hippocampus, so interhemispheric with each other, the connectivity doesn't change over age. So that's the blue line that you see that is stable. But the posterior hippocampus actually does sort of decline. The connectivity declines with older age. And we also found that the connectivity, and that's in the green and the orange, and that we found that the connectivity within the hemisphere from anterior to posterior connectivity, posterior hippocampus, that decreases with older age as well. So what we do see here is that it really seems that it's important to look at the specific area of the hippocampus, and that it's really this posterior hippocampus that connects with this default mode regions. That's where we see this decline in connectivity, as you can see here. Then a next step that I was interested in, so we do see these age-related differences in default network. We see specific differences in hippocampal, posterior hippocampal connectivity. But then, what is the association with these differences in memory? And of course, we can look at resting state connectivity and compare it to memory function. But still, I think the best way to look at it is as actually using a task. So in this next result that I want to show you is looking at brain activity during successful memory encoding across the lifespan. So we did a memory encoding task. So what you see here, the encoding phase is just simply looking at pictures and saying if it's an indoor and outdoor scene. And then outside, that was inside of the scanner. And then 30 minutes later, outside of the scanner, there was a recognition task. So, and what I want to highlight here actually is in this sample, so this is a lifespan sample, and this is really including children. So this is a collaboration with Noah Ofen, who's also at Wayne State. And we really combined efforts so that we have children from 8 years old all the way to older adults to 85 years old. So you really see the whole lifespan here. And we looked at, well, initially just the performance on this task. And I'm just showing this. This is the accuracy of the encoding phase. And of course, saying if it's an outdoor and indoor scene, that's pretty easy. So everybody does really well, above 95% accuracy. We do see some differences. Probably the kids were not as focused as the older adults were. So in the next analysis, we only used the trials that they were actually looked at and that they judged correctly. So then the performance on the recognition task. And we really see, I think, a nice sort of effect here of first the age-related maturation, so that you see that children, their performance is lowest, and then it increases in young adulthood. So this is this developmental increase in performance, but then we also see this age-related decline in the later life. So then looking at the correlation of the brain data here. So the brain images here, and this is the activation that is greater during the remembered items versus the forgotten items. And here again we see, I think, this nice developmental effect of maturation, so that you see that the magnitude of the activation here is higher, when kids get older. So in older adulthood sort of peaks, but then with older age we see this magnitude decline. And we see a similar effect here for the inverse of the subsequent memory effect. So this is more activation during forgotten items versus remembered items. And here we see a similar pattern, so that there's a lower magnitude in the older adults, and sort of the young adults have the highest magnitude here. But what we're really interested in here was, what is the relationship with performance? So do we see some of these brain measures? How does this relate to the performance on the task? And we found that only in the negative subsequent memory effect that we found that there was a relationship with performance. And as you can see, this negative subsequent memory effect is really these regions that are these default network regions. But looking at this, we see a nice correlation between performance and this, the magnitude of the negative subsequent memory effect. But we were wondering, is this also the same across the lifespan? And we actually found, and let me show you this first, we found an interaction so that it is not the same for every age group. And to highlight that a little bit more is that you see that this relationship is really mainly just significant in the adolescents and the young adults, and not in the children and not in the older groups. So there really seems to be sort of this developmental optimization, so that when you get to adolescents, young adults, you really have this fine-tuned relationship between your brain activation and your performance. But then later in life, this declines, and this relationship is not as strong anymore, even absent. So, and this is work by Patrick Pruitt, a postdoc in my lab, and he's presenting a poster on this tomorrow. So I'm just going to give him a plug, so go and talk to him at his poster. And then I want to move on, and this is also a work from Patrick Pruitt, is, we see these differences, in brain activation, and that there's a relationship with memory encoding. But what we're interested in, especially if you look at these differences in the same regions like default areas, we also see resting state connectivity differences. So we were wondering, so during a task, what is the connectivity sort of in the background, when people are performing a task? So we use the same data here, and so it's a task data, but we looked at the task context or task residual functional connectivity. So we regressed out a specific task because we're not interested in a specific task because we looked at that, with the task design. But now we were interested more like what's going on in the background, and do we see a similar pattern as what you would see with resting state? And we actually do see a very similar pattern. So here we see, specifically in the default mode network, we see in this task context or sort of background connectivity, we see that it's lower in children and then sort of higher magnitude in these connectivity in adolescents and young adults, and then lower in older adults again. We also looked at some other brain areas, and we see that in the executive control network, there's no differences across age, so they all have the same connectivity. The salience network, we do see differences. So we see that there's lower connectivity in older adults in the salience network. And then we also were interested in between network connectivity. So, in the background from when people are doing a task, but if, more in the background, like how these brain networks interacting. And we see that specifically the interactions between the default network and these other networks, that's where we see differences in that the older adults actually have higher connectivity than the younger adults across these networks. And we did not see that for the connectivity with the executive control and salience network. So it seems to be really specific to the default mode network that we see these changes. And this is really in line with also resting state findings of lower within network connectivity with aging, and then higher between network connectivity. And again, this is work by Patrick Pruitt, so you can also talk to him about this. So then for my last 2 minutes, I just quickly wanted to talk a little bit about another line of research that I do in my lab, and that's really looking at early detection of neurodegeneration or dementia. And I just wanted to show you quickly one result that we had, looking sort of at this initial stage, the sort of preclinical stage, because we've been talking a lot about normal aging that you see in these green lines here, but I'm also interested in when do we see maybe differences from normal aging to when it changes into a dementia, and what do we see in this really early stage when people do not have any dementia yet or not any observable, pathology. So just a little bit of background. So we know that with Alzheimer's disease, that there is, again, the default network seems to be really associated with changes and decreased connectivity in Alzheimer's patients versus controls. So even though we see this age-related change, we also see an additional change in this network with Alzheimer's disease. And there's this model that has been proposed that specifically sort of starting from the posterior default mode network, that this network is really active during just regular aging, and that you see what I just showed you, that there is a decrease in connectivity in this core sort of network, and that this age-related decrease, but then also maybe some other risk factors for Alzheimer's, that really starts this sort of propagation, of faulty connectivity throughout the whole system. So, and that this is the start sort of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So why I'm bringing this up here is because it's mainly focusing on that this posterior default mode network is also really important if you want to look at early detection of Alzheimer's disease, because this seems to be the area that is sort of the earliest where you would find some changes. So that's what I've been looking at in this group of people who have these subjective cognitive decline, so these people, healthy older adults, cognitively unimpaired, but they have memory concerns and they feel that they're not performing as they should. And they do, there's research that shows that they have a higher risk of getting dementia. So what we found here, and this is work by Ray Viviano, a graduate student in my lab, is that it's mainly this posterior network, memory network or posterior default mode network, where we see lower connectivity in people with subjective cognitive decline than in healthy older adults, and particularly in this connection with the retrosplenial cortex to precuneus. So it seems to be really driven by this posterior part of the default network. So, and again, these are healthy older adults, but we do see this already, this change in this area that could indicate possible early dementia or decline. Okay, so to wrap up here, so the takeaway messages from my talk is that we do see these default network differences across the lifespan, and even from children to older adults. So we see this, maturation in development and then an age-related decline. And then we also see that there's the same regions that are also vulnerable to changes possibly related to neurodegeneration. And then I wanted to end with sort of a methodological note, and this is, even though we're looking at sort of these, brain networks, and we want to look at a bigger picture, I think it's still very important to also look at specific brain anatomy. And the example is with the hippocampal study, that there was a lot of inconsistency in findings because we were not looking specifically at these, different pathways that you have in a specific region. So that's one point, and then the other point is also that I think we always have to link it back to cognitive function because that's really the symptoms that people have when they have decline. So this is maybe something that we can also talk about after the whole session is done. And we can talk a little bit more about network science and to look at, don't look over specific anatomy and cognition. So these are just some acknowledgements of my lab members, collaborators, and my funding. And I'm already 2 minutes over time, so I apologize. So I just quickly want to introduce the next speaker, and then we'll do questions afterwards at the end of every speaker. So please also welcome me and then introducing Doug Garrett for his next talk. Thank you very much.